Good morning and happy Sabbath. It's a blessing to be here this morning, to be able to study together. And if you look at your bulletin, agriculture and education, their role in character development and evangelism. Now, if we look outside, it doesn't look like ideal growing weather, does it? But the winter's a good time to start learning about agriculture and evangelism and character development. As I was thinking and praying about the subject to cover this morning, and as I was thinking about this main theme, I had to recognize it's certainly not something that I have mastered. I've done evangelism, but I've never done an agricultural-themed evangelistic series or anything like that, although we have had agriculture nuggets at cooking classes. And I suppose if I were to look at my gardens, they would not be very model gardens. But nonetheless, is agriculture something that is important for us as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists? And a question that I want to ask today is why? Why is it important for us? From the book Adventist Home, page 146. So long as God gives me power to speak to our people, I shall continue to call upon parents to leave the cities and get homes in the country where they can cultivate the soil. When we look at Sister White's call for country living, we see it many times tied in with the opportunity and the availability to be able to work with the soil and to grow produce. And then as I thought more about the subject, agriculture and education, and character development. Is there a connection between those three things? Agriculture, education, and character development? Many times we look at agriculture as a business and education as something that is done to prepare for our vocation, and character development as something that takes place over a lifetime. But I believe they're much more connected than what we many times recognize and realize. And as I thought back upon it, I recognized that I have been greatly blessed. Maybe I don't have an extreme wealth of knowledge in agricultural methods, but I have been blessed by agriculture and education. When I was 4 years old, my parents purchased 40 acres of land in Iowa. They still live there. And it was in the very southern part of Iowa where the soil was not very good. Now, I have since found out that soil in Iowa that is not very good can be much better than many other places. But it was not very good, and as we moved on to that piece of land, it was in what was the boom years in Iowa in farming during that time, and they had tried to farm this land. Now, there's not one flat piece of area on the entire property, but they had tried to farm this land, and the land was extremely scarred from the farming that had been done. When we moved on to it, there was a hand pump well, and that was the only thing on it except for one section that, not a section in agriculture terms, but one part of this piece of land that had been, they were trying to grow soybeans. That was the last time that they grew soybeans there. And shortly after we moved on to this land, my parents began to grow a garden. And I remember growing the garden. Now, we were not Adventist at this point in time, but my parents were doing many things that our counsel tells us to do. Sister White says that with children, that they should have their own area in the garden that they can work with. We had our own areas that we could work with that were our areas, but then we had a lot of other areas that we had the privilege of working in as well. And as I thought back over my experience there, and although my parents were learning to garden and the soil was not very good, they have improved it greatly now until it can be very beautiful if you visit it at the right time, not this time of year. I realized that has contributed and been a great blessing to me in my life as my parents were following some of the counsels that we have, not even knowing the counsels that we have. And growing up as a boy, I rarely remember going to a grocery store. Now, I'm not saying that we did not go to a grocery store. But we would buy every month or so, we would get lots of bulk flour, oatmeal, cornmeal, things like this. And in the summertime, where you would have products from the garden from about March through September or October in Iowa, and we would be eating from the garden. In the wintertime, my parents had several, I don't know how many, big gallon glass jars, and we were always growing sprouts. And so, although we couldn't eat from the garden, we were eating lots and lots of sprouts. You know, there are several things that I grew up eating a lot of that I didn't realize were expensive delicacies until later. I didn't know that sprouts were considered a delicacy. The other thing that I didn't know is asparagus. We ate asparagus for 3 months straight, and there was not really anything special about it. We just ate it. Sometimes we wish we weren't eating it, but we ate it. Now, we did go to a local orchard, and we bought boxes of apples as they had those. And there was times when we went to the grocery store, but it wasn't a lot. And as I think back on my experience, I recognize the great blessing that agriculture and the country has been to me. Even if it was not my favorite, I much preferred and probably still prefer a hammer to a hoe. But it still was a great blessing. But I come back to the question, why are we to be involved in agriculture? Why should we garden? Is it because of GMO products? Is it because there are seed companies that have monopolies on the seed industry? Is it because the mark of the beast is coming and we will be in a time when we cannot buy or sell? All of those may be factors, but I do not believe that any of those things are the main reasons why God has called us to be involved in agriculture. I want to go back to the statement we read from Adventist Home, page 146. I stopped mid-sentence, so I'll finish it now. So long as God gives me power to speak to our people, I shall continue to call upon parents to leave the cities and get homes in the country where they can cultivate the soil and learn from the book of nature the lessons of purity and simplicity. The things of nature are the Lord's silent ministers given to us to teach us spiritual truths. They speak to us of the love of God and declare the wisdom of the great master artist. She says that we should move to the country where we can cultivate land, and then she tells us why. Because the things of nature are God's ministers to us. Was it God's ideal that we be involved in agriculture before anybody ever knew of GMO? Was it God's ideal that we be involved in gardening even before there was a knowledge or close to a Sunday law or anything like that? Was that God's ideal? So those may be factors, but they are not the real reason. The real reason that we find is that when we are involved in working in the soil, God has ministers to us right there to teach us spiritual things. And notice what it says, to teach us. They speak to us of the love of God and declare the wisdom of the great master artist. Did I read that wrong? Yeah, great master artist. The garden is the story of God's love to us. And if we neglect that, we are neglecting a blessing that we can learn of God's love to us. But not only is the garden the story of God's love to us, when we look in the Bible, we see the gardens in the Bible are the story of God's love to us. And I want to go through and look at the gardens of the Bible. And I want to look at what I'm entitling From Garden to Garden. Where do you think we're going to begin? Genesis chapter 2, in Eden itself. Now, when we look in Genesis chapter 2, the very first garden here, at least the very first garden that we have record of, Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, we see a very interesting phrase. In Genesis chapter 1, what has God just done? He's created the heavens and the earth, right? So God has made everything, and how does He do it? He speaks and it is done, right? Now, Genesis 2 is going to back up and give us a little bit more detail in some of the aspects, particularly on the sixth day of creation. But I want to notice what it says here, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 8. And the Lord God, what does it say? Planted a garden eastward in Eden. And there He put the man whom He had formed. The Lord God planted a garden. Now, it doesn't tell us how He planted the garden. But when you talk about planting a garden, what do you normally do? Let me ask you, if you talk about planting a garden, does your garden get planted? Too often we talk about planting a garden and don't plant it, right? God planted a garden. One of the first things that he did, he planted a garden and he put man in the garden. God considered the garden so important, even in this unfallen world, that he himself planted it. Notice verse 15. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. God takes man, and what does he do? He put him in the garden. God gave man his first profession, did he not? In an ideal world, God planted the ideal garden that was his ideal plan for man to dress and to keep the garden there. Now let me ask you, were there GMOs here? Only God-made organisms, right? There was no danger of a Sunday law or anything like that, but God still, in an unfallen world with perfect people, saw that they needed a garden. Why did they need a garden? I believe God put man in a garden to learn lessons from him. That as man worked, we see in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, that the Lord in the cool of the day comes where? Comes to the garden to meet with man, right? No doubt God wanted man to learn lessons as he worked in the garden throughout the day, and then God wanted to teach him lessons directly as he communed with him in the cool of the day. And when we look throughout the rest of the Bible, we see that God's ideal plan for man was to continue in agricultural lines. When we come down to the latter part of Genesis, and now they're in Egypt. And you remember what Joseph says to his brothers. He says, I'm going to take you before Pharaoh, and you're going to talk to him, but this is what you say. Do you remember what he told them to say? We are husbandmen. We take care of the flocks. Why did Joseph instruct them to do that? It was true, first of all, but there was another deeper reason that God instructed Joseph, or Joseph instructed his brothers, rather, to tell Pharaoh this. Because Joseph wanted to shield his brothers from the contaminating influences of Egypt. Joseph knew that Pharaoh's gratitude towards Joseph would lead him to place his brothers in positions of honor within the cabinet of Egypt. And so Joseph says, tell them what you are. Tell them that you are husbandmen and that you are farmers. Tell them that you work with the cattle and with the ground so that you can be shielded from the evil influences that are there. God designed agricultural work as the ideal for man because he knew it would be a shield for many evil influences. Is that concept still true today? Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 10 through 12. God now is going to bring his people to the promised land. And you remember, as he's describing it here, how he describes it, but I want to notice what God says about the promised land that he is bringing his people into. Deuteronomy 11, 10 through 12. For the land whither thou goest in to possess is not as the land of Egypt, from whence ye came out, where thou sowest thy seed, and waterest it with thy foot, as a garden of herbs. But the land whither ye go to possess is a land of hills and valleys, and drinketh water of the rain of heaven, a land which the Lord thy God careth for. The eyes of the Lord thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end of the year. God promises, and he says, the land I'm taking you to is not like Egypt. What was different? Where does almost all of the population of Egypt live? Right along the Nile River. Why? Because that's the water that goes through, right? And so they take the water from the Nile and they irrigate with the water from the Nile, and that is how they grow. There's also the flooding cycles and things like that that were involved in their agriculture in Egypt. But God says Canaan is going to be different. You are not going to need the Nile River. I am going to water this garden for you. God was bringing his people to a land that was a heavenly watered garden. And throughout the Bible, we see in virtually every book of the Bible, at least the Old Testament, allusions to agriculture. The economy of Israel revolved around agriculture. The religious calendar of Israel revolved around agriculture. The feasts were related, the yearly gatherings were related at a time to agriculture. The promises and the prophecies many times are in agricultural terms. Why was this God's ideal? It's because the things of nature are the ministers of spiritual things to us. They teach us of the love of God. What does gardening teach us? There's a lot of things, and it's impossible to exhaust them. We're not even going to try, but I'm going to suggest a few things. Does it teach hard work? But does it also give an opportunity at other times of year for other pursuits as well? God designed the feast, and about a month of their time was taken going to the feast when they had time in the agricultural season. I believe that gardening and agriculture teaches faith like probably no other profession. You know, we read in the Bible about praying for the early and the latter rain, and we apply that prophetically to us today, right? But was that something that they literally did then as well? Do Christian farmers still pray for rain today? You know, the beauty of it is when you plant a garden, you work hard and you do everything that you can, right? Is that enough? You'd work as hard as you can have a backache, whatever else, and still it will result to nothing without God's blessing. We can work with the soil, we can plant the seeds at the right time, we can water, but we're not in control of the temperatures, are we? The storms we have no control over. There's things that are simply beyond our hands. But it teaches that we do our part, we do everything we can, and then we trust in the one that can do everything. Is that the way faith and works work? That's righteousness by faith, is it not? In James chapter 5, it talks about the husbandman or the farmer waiting with long patience. In gardening, do you learn some things about patience as well? We like to have immediate gratification. But when you work in a garden, and when the children work in the garden, they learn that some things take time. Is that a lesson that we still need to learn today? Perhaps the patience of the saints is learned in the garden. Something else that we see interesting in the Bible, we see that a lesson that our spiritual condition directly affects the work of our hands. Malachi chapter 3, 10 and 11, God says, "Bring all the tithes and offerings into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house." And then he says in verse 11, "And I will rebuke the devourer for thy sakes." There's a connection between the blessings of heaven and our spiritual condition. And we could look at other aspects. Everything we see teaches us of the miracle working and sustaining power of our God. Jesus told the parable of the man that cast seed into the ground. And then it says something very interesting in Mark chapter 4, verse 27. It says he cast seed into the ground and it springs up and it grows. And then it says he does not know how. Do we understand that mystery yet today? We still don't understand. It's the miracle-working power of our God. Consciously or unconsciously, working in creation directs our minds to our Creator. And it has a definite effect on our lives. As I've had opportunity to travel, and particularly the Democratic Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the poorest. It is ranked, last I knew, as the poorest country in the development index in the world. And when you fly in, of course, you have to fly into a city. But where we're working and where we're helping the local people to work is out into an area where Adventists had not gone before, and it's out where there's nothing. When it was first described to me 10 or 12 years ago, or more maybe, and he said, the people there are so poor, they cannot buy salt or soap. They have a little bit more salt and a little bit of soap now, I've seen out there. But at that time, there was very little. But the first time I was in Congo, I spent about 5 weeks in the capital city doing an evangelistic series. The next time I went out to where the people that we were helping, where they were out working in the countryside. And there was a drastic difference between those in the city and those in the country. It was as obvious as night and day. And as I tried to think about it, I tried to fathom why anybody would go into the city out from the village, because it was so much better out in the village. In the city, I would have people that would come up to me and say, "I haven't eaten all week." In the village, we would have to close our evening meeting at 3 o'clock so that they could go and out into the jungle and find some food to eat, but at least they went and they found some food to eat. When I was out in the village, I never had anybody come to me and tell me that they hadn't eaten for a prolonged period of time. Why? Because they had gardens there, and because they had the forest and they could find things there. But more than that, the character of the people is different. Because when people are crowded together in the smog and everything else, and there's very little natural anything, when you walk around the city, you're walking through trash dumps, it has an effect. There's crime. There's violence, there's immorality, there's these things. I'm not saying that doesn't exist at all out in the village, but I can say it's much less. Why? I believe because whether it was conscious or unconscious, the things of nature were the ministers of spiritual things. And God knows we need all of the help in being ministered to spiritually that we can get, don't we? And so God in His love gives us these directions. That's our first garden, the ideal garden. The garden that God planted. God's design for man originally. But we know the story. Tragically, God's ideal garden became poisoned. Man did not learn the lessons of faith and trust God had designed from His garden. And man ate the noxious weed instead of the life-giving fruit. And what was the immediate result? Thorns and thistles began to grow. And we find the land cursed again after Cain's murder of his brother. Somehow, the life-giving garden and the soil thereof needed some modifications now. When the land doesn't produce, what do you need to do? You need to add something to it, right? Now, there can be various ways to build back the soil. It can be through compost. It can be through other organic means. It can be through cover crops, whatever. But the soil needs to be built again, right? Something from outside needed to be added. Go with me to John chapter 18. I want to come to our next garden. I'm not saying it's the next garden in the Bible, but the next one we are going to look at. John chapter 18. Jesus is here. It's the last day of Jesus' ministry. Jesus has commemorated His death through the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, communion service. He has given the instructions to His disciples recorded in John 13 through 16. And then notice what the record says in John 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, He went forth with His disciples over the brook Kidron. Where was what? Where was a garden, into the which He entered and His disciples. We call this the garden of what? Gethsemane. For Jesus' agony, and when Jesus wrestled with that cup of trembling, whether to drink it or not, Jesus went to a garden. Let's go to Matthew chapter 22. Verses 39 through 42. And He came out and went, as He was wont, to the Mount of Olives. And His disciples also followed Him. And when He was at the place, He said unto them, Pray that ye enter not into temptation. And He was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if Thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but Thine be done. Jesus wrestling with the sins of the world in the Garden of Gethsemane. I want to read a statement from Bible Commentary, Volume 5, page 1103. The Garden of Eden, with its foul blot of disobedience, is to be carefully studied and compared with the Garden of Gethsemane. where the world's Redeemer suffered superhuman agony when the sins of the whole world were rolled upon him. God planted a garden and he put man in the garden, an ideal garden. But now Jesus goes to another garden, not the Garden of Eden, not an ideal garden. Jesus goes to a redemptive garden. Because this earth had been poisoned. And we see in this garden as Jesus is struggling with this superhuman agony, as he is wrestling with the sins of the world. We see something that happens in verse 44. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Of course, the description of Jesus' agony as he is suffering for us. But as I thought of that, God planted the Garden of Eden in the beginning, and through redemption, God watered the garden with his own blood. But go back to John. John tells us something else about Jesus' agony. John chapter 19, verse 41. Not only did Jesus water the garden with his own blood, but we find that Jesus was planted in the garden to give life to man as well. Verse 41. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a what? A garden. And in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. Jesus watered the garden with his own blood to redeem man, and Jesus, as it were, was planted in the garden to redeem man. But as he was planted, what came forth? He was resurrected. And when he was resurrected, and his followers come to the garden to find him there, they find an empty tomb. And Mary is crying. And she sees someone and she says, "Can you tell me where you've laid him?" Who did she think he was? A gardener. Who was it? Jesus. Jesus watered the garden with his blood. He was planted in the garden, and he was mistaken for a gardener in his resurrection. Go to John chapter 12, verse 24. Jesus had promised this. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Was Jesus this corn, grain that was going to fall into the ground and die? And he was who was going to spring forth and bear much fruit as well. Jesus watered the garden with his blood. He was planted in the garden to give us the opportunity to be fruit for his name's honor and glory. Because he desires to restore us to a garden again. He put man in a garden in the beginning, but his ideal, he has a restored garden as well. And Jesus is going to come back, and in Revelation chapter 14, what does Jesus do when he comes back? He harvests. In Genesis 1, God plants a garden. In John 18, Jesus waters the garden with his blood. And when he returns, he harvests the garden. God is the master gardener. He plants, he waters, and he is harvested as well. And as he comes back, he's going to restore Eden again. Do you want to be in that restored Eden again? God has a farm for us. Let me read that to you. This is from Youth Instructor, January 4, 1900. It rests with us to decide whether he shall control our hearts and minds, or whether we shall have a place in the new earth, a title to Abraham's farm. God calls the new earth Abraham's farm. And each one of us are going to have a little plot that is our own in this farm as well. Go to Micah chapter 4, verse 4. This phrase is used several times throughout the Bible. It's used prophetically at least twice, once here in Micah and also in Zechariah. But they shall sit, every man under, what does it say? His vine, and what else? And his fig tree. And none shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts hath spoken it. God sees we need our own space. God sees that even in a perfect world, we need something that can be our own vine and our own fig tree, our own garden plot in Abraham's farm. God is going to restore a garden. The Bible is a story from garden to garden. And this story from garden to garden is made possible by the one that suffered in the garden for us. Jesus in Gethsemane, suffering in that garden, makes it possible for us to sit in a perfect world, in a perfect land, every man under our own vine and fig tree. And God has given us a blessing here. He's given us a blessing of having the opportunity to learn the lessons that He wanted Adam and Eve to learn in the garden. Lessons of faith, lessons of patience, lessons of trust, lessons of God's miracle working power. As we journey from garden to garden through what Jesus has done for us. And as we work in our garden, it can be a little foretaste of us, to us, of working eternally in the garden of heaven with the master gardener, the one that planted a garden in Eden, the one that watered it with his own blood, and the one that's coming back to harvest it very soon. May we recognize that journey from garden to garden. And may we recognize the blessing that God has given to us in working in the garden as preparing to work in that heavenly garden. And may we determine by the grace of God that we're not going to let anyone steal our plot in Abraham's farm.
We hope you have been blessed by this message. If you would like more information about other programs or sermons by this speaker, please contact EGN at 1-800-774-3566. That's 1-800-774-3566. On behalf of the entire EGN team, thank you for watching.